Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melissa and Carissa, for inviting us here. It's really a pleasure to speak to everyone, and I'm really glad to see all of you, especially so late in the evening. So this is a topic I'm pretty passionate about, but I have to say, it's sort of a culmination of a lot of different things in my background. And I think, as you sort of move through your career path, you'll find that you'll pull from different areas. So I started out as a biomedical engineer at USC. I went to medical school at Stanford. And during my time in the Valley, I really recognized that there are amazing entrepreneurs coming up with great ideas. And it was an enormous challenge for them to get these great ideas in the hands of physicians and to the bedside of patients where they could really make an impact on clinical outcomes. And so I sort of pivoted and said, how do I scale my effort? How do I think about, helping to make some of these decisions where you can actually get these products to market and have a little bit bigger of an impact? And so I ended up doing strategy and operations at Novartis Diagnostics before moving into venture capital, where effectively I do now, I evaluate and invest in early stage companies, and it's very similar to what I did at Novartis from a corporate perspective. So that's sort of my my trajectory so far, but I would also say that I'm still figuring out what I want to be when I grow up. So continue. Over to you, Monique.
I would definitely echo the same thing that Tracy said. I've had quite a wandering path that started out at Harvard. So for all the Lowell House folks in the audience, hey. I studied medical anthro in undergrad, and I did a master's in health policy planning and financing at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, jointly with the London School of Economics, and went to medical school back again at Harvard. And I had a time in my life when I was a global health consultant, and in that space, I very much gravitated towards technologies and systems that could use technologies to think about how they might strengthen how they deliver care and to think about access. And it's really interesting because that's a universal thought, right? So when you come back and think about that domestically, the same holds true. Whether you're talking about digital health, diagnostic devices, so on and so forth. So when I moved out to the Bay and had the opportunity to work with several founders in this space, digital health space largely, I really started to think about how I wanted my career to look. I'm a practicing emergency physician at our St. Janet Hospital in Atlanta. And when I moved back here, I had a clear vision of what it is that I wanted to be doing and who I wanted to be doing it with. And part of that's working across the entire acute care spectrum to think through what the frontier of medicine should look like, and working with early stage startups to make that happen, and doing that from the perspective of the healthcare institution. So having the luxury of having the people who are going to be implementing the care and having some of the payer side on our side as well to think through that piece, and doing that from an institutional perspective. So it's been a great journey. And like Tracy, every day I find out new things about myself and what I'll be doing next. So, it's always evolving.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. There's some incredible experiences you have under your belt. What challenges have you both faced as women of color in two traditionally male-dominated industries, both medicine and venture capital? How have you overcome these barriers, and what is your advice for young women and more generally young founders looking to follow in your footsteps?
I'll take a stab at that one. I think I have a pretty unusual answer. And that I think Harvard trained me well in that it taught me that there was no door that should be closed to me. And part of that is kind of that mentality of anything I want to do, I should be able to do it. So I think throughout time, I've been pretty oblivious since college and onwards about what I should and should not be doing. So kind of setting my own set of rules, as well as kind of coming in the door with the expectation that people are going to meet me there. And I've been really fortunate that one, I've chosen not environments, but I've chosen roles that are well suited for me. And quite frankly, I defined those roles before I got there. So often, the jobs that I've had, the roles that I've had haven't come from from applying through a pool of folks. It's actually come from conversations and utilizing my network. And then within that network, telling somebody, this is my vision, this is what I want to do, and them giving me the opportunity to do it, which is pretty rare, and certainly rare for a Black woman. But I think the thing that shocks people the most is that I mean it. When I say that I'm going to found the center and I'm going to work 4 shifts a month, and that's the job that I want, even though you're offering me a emergency medicine job where you should be working 12 to 16 shifts and grinding it out, within 6 to 12 months, someone finally bought into that plan. So saying it enough times and really fundamentally myself believing that there's nothing or no one who should be able to tell me no. I mean, you just aren't the right fit. So I guess I'll move on.
Yeah, I'm going to echo that in terms of what Monique is saying. I mean, I think there's a quote that really has stuck with me, right? And so Theodore von Karman, who was, I think, one of the first inductees of the National Academy of Engineering, was saying, scientists discover the world that is, and engineers create the world that never was. And so obviously that doesn't mean that nobody else except for engineers can do that, but especially, in this age of technological innovation where we're accelerating innovation so much, right? That doesn't apply just to specific technologies. It applies to what you want to do with your skill set and how you want to create that future for yourself too. Absolutely, right? So I think it's, I don't think anybody would have looked at, nobody would have looked at me, 20 years ago and said, okay, these are the random things that you're going to do, and then you're going to end up here, right? This is definitely not a linear career path, right? But I think, understanding yourself and understanding what your passions are and what you're good at, and then being able to gravitate towards learning experiences, gravitate towards things that challenge you, and you will amass a skill set that will then enable you to sort of build these, these roles for yourself, right? Because also, right, Monique didn't just, come out of high school and say, great, I'm going to do this, right? But all her experience to that point had helped her, have that network. And for me, the same thing happened too, right? I was doing a lot of learning in different areas, and I'm working now with somebody I worked with 10 years ago. And that's why I'm in VC now. I did not take a traditional path where I applied and climbed up through the ranks, right? So you never really know. And I think that's the beauty of what we're doing today. So you can both build your skill set, but then be open to novel things that you can do. It doesn't have to be linear. So as a woman of color, I think, not only for everyone, but having that network and having that credibility and building your sort of board of directors, as it were, is incredibly important. And you've got great resources right now where your students and people are willing to really help you. And so I think to leverage that and sort of to really build those relationships, and those are going to be what comes back and sort of helps you maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So invest in people and yourself.
Absolutely, that's amazing advice. And just to pick up on the last bit of what you said, Tracy, about the fact that a lot of paths into VC are not super linear, and that a lot of the time it's about depending on your network, it's about building up credibility, especially as minorities in VC. Like, do you have any specific tips about how best college students can take advantage of networks and like kind of build up a good personal reputation in the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about maintaining that level of curiosity, even when you are in a role where you've got deliverables, where you've got to, say, I've got to get this thing done, right? But being able to be curious and being able to be open to things that you might not know, right? Because I think, as people progress along their career path, you get a lot of people who tend to narrow in their focus, right? And not necessarily from a from a sector point of view, but from a a mindset point of view. And so being open to looking at best practices from different industries, from people who have different experiences from you, and just having coffee with that random person. So Monique and I met each other at a digital health conference. We were in the buffet line together, right? So you never know who's going to be a great friend and an amazing contact, and part of your close network. So I think being open is incredibly important. And also don't feel like you have to force something, right? Some of the relationships will flow naturally and some of them won't, and that is completely fine, right? You're not expected to, collect, mentors like you do. I mean, LinkedIn is a little bit, it's a little bit ridiculous now because people are connected to people they don't necessarily know. But I think having that group of people who you can really rely on, who you can go to for good advice, who know you, that's incredibly important to have. So I would invest in deeper, fewer relationships if you have the opportunity, right? And sort of spread the net wide. So
I would echo that and say that there's such power in the informational interview. like, and there's also power in being a student and being a Harvard student and what that opens for you. The sort of cold call emails that you can make and say, hey, are you willing to have like a 30-minute chat with me, and to learn more about what someone else does and figure out where they see an industry going. Often I think the informational interview is thought of as like, oh, I need to get these connections to get these types of jobs. But what I found most interesting about doing them is really getting someone else's beat of where the industry is headed. What are the skill sets that I should be looking towards? How should I start molding myself for someone who's already there, right? And what are the pieces and elements of their story that resonate with me as things that I might want to look into or try out or learn more about? So I think don't forget the power of being a student, which is a relatively non-threatening term, because once you leave that coveted space, it becomes a little more threatening. People are asking why, what do you want from me? Versus you have this kind of this pathway to get people's ear and to leverage not just the network that is on campus, but certainly the wider global Harvard network through the kind of alumni association and so forth and so on. So don't be ashamed to use it. We were all there at one point in time wondering what next and how we would shape our careers. So dig in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the advice. I'm sure that our attendees can take a lot of practical advice away from what you just said. And one last question on your background. I noticed that you don't come from super traditional, like kind of business, economics, finance backgrounds. I know that you've got very specialist knowledge in like the medical fields. Would you say that like all of those skills are really transferable to the work that you now do in the VC and innovation space? Or would you say that there were some knowledge gaps that you needed to fill doing your own work along the way?
Tracy and I are both smiling because we talk about this all the time. It's again the path, right? I think there's, when you think about getting, I love to call them finishing degrees, right? If you think about getting a degree beyond your undergrad degree and you think about what it gives you, it's usually packaged in a very clear form. You're going to take these courses, maybe have a little bit of flexibility here and there to focus in on something. But really what you learn once you're kind of hopping into the workplace is that you learn most of what you do on the job, most of it is figuring out where are the right resources to know how to do it. And there's some fundamentals, like learning mathematics, 2 + 2 is 4. I mean, you can't get away from that, right? But there's a lot that you're never going to learn until you're in the middle of a project, not knowing what to do, right? Or you're trying to start a company and you have zero idea of, how to put together a P&L, right? So I mean, it's those pieces that you can forecast a few things and say, hey, maybe it's useful to take this set of this coursework and have this basis from a business perspective. But then again, there's so much more that you can also learn on the fly. So to be very specific, I have probably taken somewhere between 12 plus classes across business schools globally, right? So that's including kind of in London, as well as in Zaragoza, on the East Coast between MIT and Harvard, and on the West Coast at UCSF. I think in Jamaica as well. So anywhere there was a class that I was interested in at the time because it was relevant to work that I was doing, I took it, and it paid off. And it paid off because it gave me, first of all, the vocabulary to be able to speak with colleagues in that space. So I'm never coming to a conversation just as a physician, as kind of a health policy geek. I come to the conversation as a full person who's able to use language that someone on the other side can understand. And if I'm in the middle of a project, usually I have enough of a base from when I built up to be able to dig in, and if I need more, to figure out what resources I need. And I think that's the fundamental skill in the gap filling side.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think that, I was considering doing an MBA, after med school. And I talked to a lot of friends and I talked to a lot of people about that. And they said, it's not just, the MBA, but in my case, right, they said, a lot of people just use that degree, one, to build the network, but then to get themselves into a specific job, right? So, they want to be a consultant or they want to be in private equity and they've already worked for a while. And this is the thing that enables them to get that network to get to the next job. If you don't necessarily have that kind of laser focus, then you probably don't want to waste time doing that, right? Go out, get work experience. And I'm so glad I did, right? Because what I did is I effectively got my MBA on the job by doing a couple years of investment banking M&A, right, at a boutique. And I was pretty clear from the get-go that I was not planning to be an investment banker for the rest of my life, because it just wasn't a fit for my personality, right? but having that real life experience, working with early stage entrepreneurs, understanding what strategic acquirers are looking for, thinking about, not just kind of modeling a P&L, and doing it for a class, but then being able to say, okay, this is what happens in real life, right? And this is why a deal could go sideways. And it's not just because of the numbers. So understanding all those nuances that you get from a real life experience are incredibly helpful. And I will say on the flip side, some of my colleagues who were, professional colleagues, for example, like at Novartis, who were told you need X degree to get promoted. They went, they did their MBA, what have you. They did not get promoted. They were not happy about it. And they ended up moving to another company, right? And so that, these types of degrees are not necessarily, sort of a gating item, right? Sometimes people use them as excuses, but I think really, really thinking about what are you gaining from the degree and what that knowledge is and what that skill set is and how can you get that in your life, whether that is by doing the degree or whether it's by having a different type of experience, could be really valuable to you, because you may not have to spend 1 or 2 years to do that. And I think sometimes, especially the speed that information changes, it's a lot more useful to have it in smaller bites and package that all together and follow your interests.
That's really great advice. Thank you. I figured we would pivot the conversation to the healthcare space more specifically, particularly what the US healthcare system looks like. So I was wondering if you could speak to what the shortcomings of the current healthcare system look like, particularly for women. Why is a medical and venture capital focus on women's healthcare specifically really important?
Sure. Well, I will. I have a couple of slides of data just so you can all see this. But the healthcare industry is an over $3 trillion industry, right? And until recently, women's health was not really. I mean, people thought it. Well, people still tell us, it's a niche business, right? So women are over 51% of the population, and we have significant challenges in sort of getting people to understand that, when you talk about personalized medicine or precision medicine, right? One of the biggest tests you're going to do is, do you have XX or XY chromosomes, right? And then a lot of outcomes sort of flow from there. So it can be a real challenge to for people to understand what's going on with women's health. And I think there hasn't necessarily been a whole lot of funding there. The reason is that, from a scientific and research perspective, a lot of organizations have said, okay, it's easier to do research on male cell lines, on male mice, because they don't have a lot of the hormonal complications that you see and the cyclical nature that you do with women. That leads to, fewer or barely any women being included in clinical trials. Cell lines were not being included in really early stage research. And so, for example, you can see some of the data here, right? But I think it was in 2016 that they started doing, the NIH made sure that you had to include a female cell line when you're doing basic science research, right? And it was only in 93 that they started letting women come back into clinical studies. So it's really challenging, right? If you don't have the data, how are you going to derive accurate insights, right? And so we're starting to get that data now, and we've got the tools to do it, but thinking about the funding that there is to actually do this research and to gather that data, it's slow to turn that around. And so what we see is, as venture capitalists, right? I mean, obviously we want to have an impact, and obviously we think this is a really important space, and we also think that's consistent with being able to do well financially. So if you look at it as a pure arbitrage opportunity, right, if there's an underfunded area, then you should probably be able to go and fund some great ideas coming out of there and make a decent amount of money, and also make sure that you're driving good outcomes for the population as well. So that's kind of a little bit about why we're focusing on women's health and female founders in healthcare. But these stats were pretty shocking, and I didn't know them when I was going through med school. We did know that the standardized patient was a 70-kilogram white male, sort of in his late 20s, early 30s. But now we know a lot more about our patients, and how they respond to various treatments. And I think that everybody, males and females, deserve to have better data and better insights so that they can have the best care that's available to them. So that's kind of, we're trying to contribute to that.
The only thing I would add to that is that, to highlight the point that Tracy made, women are the primary initiators of healthcare for households, right? So that means women are the ones that are, going to the doctor, they're sending their daughters and sons to the doctor, they're sending their husbands to the doctor, or wives to the doctor, they're sending, the other generation to the doctor. And so if you think about women as occupying this critical space, you really start to rethink how you deliver services and solutions within healthcare, right? Because if they're designed for a man, yet it's a woman who's evaluating it, a woman who's pushing people into that space, and you have to have a different set of considerations. As an emergency physician, one of the things that probably shocks me the most is how you even think about car accidents, motor vehicle accidents. There's this area of the gender ergonomics of car seats, and the fact that women suffer disproportionate amount of neck injuries in just everyday car accidents because of how car seats are made. So it's in every piece and every part of the fiber of our lives, as you can think about it from a really broad spectrum, and even on the physician side as a practicing physician, like the hand grip of our tools, such as retractors, or the fact that in a pandemic, size small gloves are nowhere to be found. And if you think about the size of women's hands versus men's hands. So there certainly is a clear opportunity, and it's a matter of kind of thinking about it alongside, how do you create ROI around that and prove that to the investor side, because it's certainly there, and women are certainly the consumers.
Yeah, thank you for the overview. It definitely sounds like there's a lot of exciting opportunity in this space, and also a massive need from 51% of the US population. I'm wondering if there have been unique challenges in investing in and working with healthcare startups focused on women that perhaps don't come up with more generalist healthcare startups. Is it the case that healthcare startups focused on women's health generally have a harder time getting funding, or what's the funding situation around that?
That's a great question. So in 2019, all female entrepreneurs received less venture capital than WeWork. So let's just let that sink in for a moment, right? So when you think about 2% of women sort of being VCs, right? And there's a lot of data coming out now in terms of thinking about when you've got more diverse populations in leadership teams, both women and people of color, right? You just get better financial outcomes, right? But unless you sort of have a woman on the investing team, people tend not to invest in more diverse founding teams, which is sort of a disservice to everyone, right? So I think what we've been seeing a lot of challenges is that women come in and they're trying to, one, get over an educational hump, right? Because we've heard so many stories about, they go pitch to a number of male VCs and they bring in their executive assistant because she's the only woman in the office, right? And so that's like their female perspective, right? So I think and they've told us that it's just a very different conversation, because we understand the unmet need. We can sort of really start going and focusing on what is your solution and how does this really solve that unmet need, rather than having to be convinced that, yes, we should be focusing on this area. And I will also say that what we consider women's health is not what's sort of more popularly known as femtech, but is not just reproductive health. So women have significantly different outcomes in cardiovascular disease, neurological disease like Alzheimer's, right? Autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis, things like that, diabetes, obesity, all of this, right? All of these things impact women differently than or more than men. And so these are not things that are, woman specific, but we should be looking at sort of treatment specific outcomes, and how do you think about really elevating the standard of care for everybody. And so we have seen that, the number of women in VC has sort of trended up a little bit, and we are starting to see many more emerging managers that are focusing on this area. And so I am heartened to see that. And we're also starting to see that some of the more traditional funds are starting to understand the value proposition here as well. But I think it's, it's something where we just kind of have to keep building building the ecosystem and building the network, and really emphasizing the returns that can be gotten from it, but then also, the long-term outcomes that can be seen as a benefit.
Yeah, I have to say that I really respect the work that Tracy and her team does to really support women founders. I think that's the fundamental piece. If you look at the numbers in terms of the amounts that are invested in early stage company for across any minority and women in particular, you'll see that there is quite a discrepancy. And that means that there is a certain scrappiness, a certain proof of concept for women who actually do succeed in creating companies. And imagine all the others that are lost in between. You're really losing what are kind of a wealth of opportunities that have high potential. So, that's where the work is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, I think it would be remiss of us if we didn't talk about COVID-19. Obviously, that's like a massive question at the forefront of everybody's minds at the moment. We've seen how COVID-19 has really changed the landscape of the healthcare industry for years to come. Could you please speak to some of the key emerging innovation trends or new technologies in the healthcare space? Monique, it'd be really interesting to hear about your insights here from leading Emory Medical School's Innovation Center. I'm sure that there's a lot of interesting new information coming out of that center.
Absolutely. I think one, there's been kind of this new energy and focus around acute care, kind of rethinking how we care for people, caring for people in place, which is something that people have really kind of struggled to wrap their heads around from very traditional medical systems, from the privacy angle to the, can we actually provide the same quality and level of care? And really how this is all enabled is certainly through the loosening of regulations. When you look at what CMS has been doing around telemedicine, and even from the drug discovery pathways, which are now looking more accelerated, you have to wonder what that will fundamentally do in the long term and what we're able to do. Because one of the biggest challenges in the healthcare space, if you're trying to innovate, is all of the rules. All the rules, and figure out who's going to buy what you're selling, right? So if we're making progress on the rule spectrum from what's happening now and how COVID is really pushing those boundaries, then there's a lot more opportunity than there was before. And the other piece that I think that's really interesting is how large corporations who have often kind of been looked to in this B2B model are really being asked to think about population health in a fundamental way. And, if you think about large corporations and how they segment their population, those who are contract versus who are offer the full, set of benefits, in putting people in place and at the front line, they're now being asked to think about this very big occupational health category in a very real way, right? So, I think there's a whole slew of opportunities there that really have to be considered that aren't really even kind of bubbling to the top yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of addressing COVID, right, from, as Monique pointed out, right, there's just enormous shifts in the landscape. And I think that it's accelerated a lot of these trends for the better, right? Because, otherwise we're not going to be getting there anytime soon. That being said, right, I think there's still a lot of, work to be done, because people are now playing catch up if they don't have a fundamental understanding sort of the industry, right? So you're starting to see a lot of people who are less familiar with navigating such a complex system as healthcare, right? And not understanding that there are, stakeholders around every corner who sometimes have, or maybe often have, slightly differing or competing, interests. And so having to navigate that is really tricky, right? And so you're starting to see a lot of people saying, we're going to fund something around this, but really trying to think about finding a smart solution, and really understanding what's going to have a benefit in the long run is still, we've always had to take the long view, right? So I think the people who have been doing this for a while and who are used to, not just trying to say, we're going to shove something in there and hope it helps, but, let's take the long view of this, and we're going to build on the research that's been done, and we're going to build on the data that we've already seen, and then we're going to try and just roll this out, incrementally for a much larger population. I think that's the kind of approach that's going to give us a long-term benefit there, right? So I think in some cases, right, some individuals are a little bit more hesitant to invest, right? I know there are a number of people who are sitting on the sidelines regarding telemedicine, right? Because they're just like, well, obviously telemedicine as a whole is something that, is beneficial, but they don't know who to back, right? And so I think having the experience to have a specific perspective on that and what you see as a valuable proposition, you could absolutely be right or you could be wrong, right? There's still a risk there, but having that specific perspective is really valuable, and being able to sort of put your nickel down and pick who you think is going to have a good chance.
And Tracy, I love that you picked the telemedicine example, because I think it expresses the landscape in a really beautiful way. And you have these traditional enterprise level players who are now sitting toe to toe with startups who have been first movers in this space. And what's interesting is how that'll all shake out in the long run. Are you going to see better relationships? Are you going to see a totally new model of care? It's hard to know.
Yeah, it's really interesting that there are so many new trends coming out of COVID-19, and these trends are definitely going to have a massive impact on healthcare for many, many years to come. In terms of the VC space, like, how have VC firms generally across the board adapted to the times, both in your work, but also like what other firms are doing? What are these key areas of growth or opportunities for general partners?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting because it's so fund specific, right? And even within a particular VC fund, right? People who have a partner title. I mean, we're a fairly new fund, right? But in the older funds, right, people who have a partner title can have very different economics around that, right? So you're still seeing, a differential influence based on specific partners' points of view, right, and sort of what they're leading. So I will just say that the individual piece on that influences, the fund perspective quite a bit. What we have seen people doing is obviously, digging in a lot more in healthcare, but then we've also seen people who are really thinking about digging a lot more in on the scientific and the clinical diligence. So, previously there was a lot more focus. What we've seen is that, people are a lot more comfortable doing more consumer focused, sort of wellness applications, right? And especially with COVID, now they're starting to really think about what could be more clinically applicable. Where do you really have that hard data? And so they're starting to take a look at that more closely. Obviously, the timelines and the regulatory aspects of that and the reimbursement aspects of that are all much more complex than running consumer business, right? So balancing those different needs and understandings that, I think is every fund ends up coming out slightly differently, and where their comfort level is with that. But I think that it's heartening to see that people are starting to understand the value of, these early stage innovations that are much more clinically oriented, and being willing to sort of think about a business that is, based on hard science and data, and not just saying we're just going to growth hack it and get a bunch of people on this, without understanding what the outcomes could potentially look like. So I see that as, something that's a favorable trend overall, and I hope it continues, after that. And
Absolutely. The next question can be directed at you both. What is your advice to founders who are innovating in the healthcare space during a pandemic world, both in terms of capturing new unmet needs of the market, but also with raising investment funds amidst so much economic uncertainty?
Okay, so I'll go first on this one, I guess. Honestly, I think with healthcare, well, especially sort of during the pandemic, because we invest early, we're sort of seed an A, and so generally at that point they've got some data, but they're generally not 510(k) cleared. They haven't gotten through the FDA. Most of them are pre-commercial, pre-revenue, right? So honestly, I think that our particular perspectives at Avestria have not changed much, right? Because we were always about, are you addressing a clear unmet need, right? Are you coming up with a solution that we think is really viable and that could really change outcomes for patients, and then we've got a number of other criteria, right? But those main ones haven't changed, and I think they've just been sort of more important during the pandemic. And so we've actually been really glad with how things have shaken out for a number of our portfolio companies, because yes, while clinical trials did slow down for a bit, most of them are just, continuing to execute on what their plans are. I would say for founders who are, starting something up right now, it's really important to do a lot of your homework up front, right? To really clearly understand that unmet need, to understand who you are innovating for, right? And that could be multiple people, right? It could be for the patient and the physician and for the health system, but you have to really understand those different points of view and, how you're addressing those. And they could be slightly different for all of those potential personas, right? And then thinking about going out and fundraising flows from that, right? Because as investors get sort of more sophisticated in that space, then they're going to start asking more about, like, how are you actually meeting this need? And the investors who are already sophisticated in the space are asking those questions already and have been. So I think it's really understanding the unmet need and really thinking about how you're crafting a solution for that, rather than trying to take a solution and finding a need for that. So I think we've seen that differentiate companies quite a bit at this point.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing, and that accessibility to your customer is really hard right now, right? So understanding that unmet need, that just got 10 times harder than it was before, but there's still a way to do it. And there's also a way to understand what the needs are that are emerging in a healthcare system that's not meeting the needs of a population, right? Like just by reading the news. So, I think there's a different way of then thinking about that and then molding towards that. And on the other hand, the ability to be in touch with people has also totally changed. The fact that people aren't meeting face to face in the same way, that you don't have to be on a certain coast to meet with a certain investor, the fact that folks are hopping on webinars like this, I think there's a new and different opportunity to connect with people in ways that you couldn't before, because it just wasn't done. You didn't email people in the same way and get the same types of responses because we weren't using platforms in the way that we were a year ago, So I take advantage of that, frankly. And also really pay a very keen eye to the sorts of opportunities that are happening from what's changing from a regulatory perspective. Because I think what's been hard about innovating within healthcare has certainly been the fact that regulations tend to vary, from state to state, the way in which, there's always kind of a pathway that has been so very strictly defined, and understanding which of those are changing, because maybe that's where a particular opportunity is for multiple reasons. One, because there's a big unmet need there that, there isn't a quick solution to. And two, because, there's a desire for innovation to happen within that space. And that desire is usually not just kind of in the, the federal realm, it's coming from somewhere, right? And so really kind of keeping an eye towards that, I think it's important as well.
For sure. And it's really interesting how you both talk about the importance of need finding and really addressing a clear unmet need, because I think that nowadays, it's very easy to look at the trends and hot button topics and want to jump on the bandwagon without having a very good idea of what it is that what value your startup is bringing to the table. So that's definitely amazing advice. We have about 20 minutes left, and so I'm very happy to open up the conversation to audience Q&A. And so if anybody has any questions, you can send them through in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would prefer to ask them aloud. I know that we already have a question in the chat from Ida. Her question is, what is your view on pediatric innovation?
So I'm happy to take that one. Acute care is acute care for everyone from our perspective, right? And so kids need acute care as well. And so thinking how we do that better and also do that in a way that makes it more effortless for parents to enable their kids to get the care that they need when they need it and in the sort of care context that they need it is important. I think that there are always challenges when thinking about doing things in the pediatric population. One, from the perspective of you almost have automatically 3 vested interests, right? So you have the kid who doesn't get a voice, you've got the parent who has a really strong opinion, and you've got the person who's actually paying for it, right? So is that is that your classic payers? Who's actually has a vested interest in making that a real thing, right? So yeah, I think it's a tough but very productive space to work within?
Yeah, I mean, from an investor perspective, I mean, our tagline would be really long if we talked about like all kind of all the underserved areas that we want to focus on. But yes, absolutely, pediatric innovation is an underfunded area and one that we find is very important as well. And so while it's not sort of in our tagline, we definitely include that sort of under the women's health bucket. Obviously, realizing that innovating for the pediatric population is kids are not small adults, so you're looking at sort of a different cut, and you're really looking at having to think very carefully about what the experience in the space is, how they're going to go through clinical trials, being able to really, kind of look at that market and address that need. So, but one of the companies in our space, actually, Radiant in our portfolio, Radiant Oximetry, has an oximeter, for a fetal oximeter that will measure the baby's oxygen level. So I don't know if any of you have ever been in the hospital. You've had to have a pulse ox, which just goes on your finger. Everybody in the hospital gets one of these. The baby doesn't when the mom's in labor, right? So they have a fetal heart rate monitor, and the jury is out as to sort of how effective that fetal heart tracing is at understanding the baby's true status and whether they're in distress, whether you need to do a C-section, all these other things. And so having an oxygen level on the fetus is just one other important vital sign that we don't have yet. And so it seems so simple, right? And it's not. So it's a pediatric anesthesiologist who basically came up with this idea. And so he's moving this through animal studies and then early clinical studies. But I mean, I think that, when you think about something that can protect, a mother and a child, right? And we've also looked at other things in the pediatric space as well. I mean, it's really critical. And there are not a lot of funds that are willing to take the long view on that, and not necessarily to sort of look at something that doesn't have that, it might not be as sexy, right, as saying I invested in like the latest SaaS company out there, right? But there's still a huge need. And so we feel that meeting that need and changing outcomes is an enormous driver that motivates us to invest in that space.
Thank you for that. If anybody else has questions, you can feel free to raise your hands, and you can unmute yourself, or you can send across your questions in the chat. But while we give the audience some time to think of some questions, I have a question about, what is it that you typically look for in a proof of concept or in an MVP before you're prepared to invest? What are some benchmark metrics perhaps that you have, or like minimum things that you want to see before you take the leap of faith and you're prepared to back a company?
Sure. So I will caveat this by saying that at Avestria, all of us, so the two founding partners and myself, we all have operating experience, which is starting to be a little bit more rare, meaning that we all were at healthcare companies before. So Corinne, one of the partners, she was a CFO taking Teleric, which is a biotech company, public, and it was acquired by Amgen. She was on the board and then the CFO and general manager at Edwards Life Sciences, which is the biggest heart valve manufacturer in the world. Linda has an amazing background in molecular diagnostics, where she did the sale of Applied Biosystems and then was also leading BD and M&A at Novartis Diagnostics. So thinking about it from sort of the corporate perspective, right? We understand the strategic piece, and so we tend to drive our entrepreneurs a little bit crazy in terms of sort of the diligence. And so that's also a big reason why we invest at seed and A stage, because one, there's an enormous funding need there for entrepreneurs, but then also we find that it's sort of a risk level that people who are more comfortable with the later stage risk, they're not as willing to invest that early, sort of pre-FDA approval or clearance, right? And then that's something where you can sort of really make a difference in catapulting some of the good ideas, onto their next funding rounds. And then when we think about sort of pre-seed, the way we see that is, people who have a really great idea but might not have the scientific data to back that up quite yet. So oftentimes they might be building out a prototype, or they might have a prototype and they're in the middle of doing a pilot study or an animal study or things like that. And so we do really like to talk to people at that stage because, investing is sort of like dating, right? You're going to have a relationship with this entrepreneur for 5 to 7 years, right? So you better be able to go through the ups and downs and have honest conversations and be able to sort of tough it out, right? It's not just great, we're going to write you a check and then hands off, right? And there's definitely money out there for that too, but we really feel that sort of partnering gives you the best shot at actually being successful in the long term. So meeting people early, understanding what they're doing, and then also seeing how they respond to bumps in the road. I think, especially for early stage companies, it's more about how do the founders and how do the team handle some of these setbacks? How do they think about things strategically? How do they take feedback? Those are some of the bigger indicators of success, right? Because the science is going to do what the science is going to do, right? And so if it doesn't come out like you thought, then yes, maybe you pivot. But if you're going to pursue a path that doesn't look as logical, and you're not sort of willing to be flexible on that, then that tells us a lot about, the potential for managing some of these things farther on down the road when some of the times you can get bigger problems. So I would say, at the early stage, in the digital health space, a lot of the pre-seed companies are raising enormous rounds and they've already got customer traction, right? But having data, and as much data as you can, whether that's around understanding how customers are using the product and their willingness to pay for it, understanding how it really meets that need in the market, understanding how it changes outcomes, all of those different things are various aspects that can help support your case and to generate more interest and more funding as you're raising money.
From the enterprise perspective, we look at things a lot differently. We're really looking to co-develop solutions that fit in with our service delivery lines. And so we have a set of what we identify as high priority unmet needs in areas that we want to move in. And so we're looking for early stage companies who are doing interesting things in that space. And so a really strong set of founders who are very passionate about making something work for populations that we serve. So it's a privileged viewpoint, frankly, because we're seeing it from the viewpoint of a healthcare system and the healthcare system's needs. And I'd say that the challenges there are then really quite different. So it's having the wherewithal from the perspective of where a company is to actually move through a healthcare system's kind of layers of bureaucracy, frankly. And those are the pieces around, how do you integrate things within large, bulky, slow-moving healthcare systems in a way that your company is still alive when we get to the end of that point, even as we're moving as fast as our institution will allow us to, right? How do we make sure that the milestones that we're setting are things that we can reach together rather than, what is only ideal for the company or only ideal for us as a department. So it's a really different set of questions that come from a co-development space.
For sure, that's a really helpful answer. Thank you. We have another question that's just come in the chat. The question says, what role do you see the venture capital field in playing, I guess, in making an impact on health equity, which I think is a fantastic question and something that's very, very relevant as of now.
I think it's critical, right? One of the things that we've been talking about for a while, right, is obviously, we're in the midst of a maternal mortality crisis in the US, and not only that, a Black maternal mortality crisis, right? If you think about Serena Williams and her profile, but then, self-diagnosing herself, we have so far to go. And so I think that's the thing, right? You have to understand that when you're building a solution, right, that you can have the biggest impact on people who currently don't have solutions, right? So our point of view as a fund, right, is that we basically don't want to invest in something unless it's going to work for Medicaid patients, right? For patients who don't necessarily have the ability to pay for a $500 device, right? But it needs to be reimbursable. It eventually needs to be able to get to that Medicaid patient, right? And it needs to be appropriate for the use cases, for their needs, right? You need to be able increasingly to get to people, at home, for the person who is working 3 jobs and who is taking the bus from one to the other, right? Who maybe has 4 kids at home, right? And so they can't necessarily come in for an hour every week and travel 2 hours to do that, right? I mean, I think even, thinking about health equity and the social determinants of health and how entrepreneurs are actually executing on this, means a great deal to us. And so that's something that we push really hard on every company that we are investing in, to understand what their pathway is, right? And so obviously, I think when you're an entrepreneur, right, the expectation is not that you're going to scale to the entire market all at once, right? But we want to see a really clear pathway. We want to see a really clear strategy to get there. So, and when you have a credible path to get there, then that's helpful for us. But I think, it's absolutely something that can't be ignored. And for us, it's sort of at the center of how we view what the impact is. I mean, we don't invest in solutions for rich people only, right? That's just who we are. So,
Yeah, that's certainly one of our core values. I mean, our tagline is how do we make acute care effortless and equitable? So we're putting it right up front, but that's what we're about. In emergency medicine, we serve everyone, right? So we think about people who come in versus 911 versus folks who come in with their own doctor at their side. That is a full spectrum of folks who are coming in and seeking care. And what's worse is when you look at the data, in terms of the sorts of differential you see in waiting times and sort of diagnostic studies ordered, and then in what you might see from an outcomes perspective, there certainly is a lot of inequity to deal with, right? So it becomes very specific, and then how we think through the sorts of innovation we do in tech-enabled care. So, one of the spaces that we're moving in quite heavily is equitable tech-enabled care. So making sure that there's intentional design that is inclusive, right? And then making sure that the sorts of solutions that we're bringing forward, we're really thinking about the channels through which we deliver them, to make sure that we're creating access in a way that is equitable. And if we're not, how else do we need to pivot that solution so it's able to provide that? So it's one of the things that we certainly push when we work with founders, when we work with startups, to make sure that we're thinking through that whole spectrum up front. And if it's not the immediate solution, working to get there. One of the spaces that is certainly hot from you're thinking about improving efficiencies and services in emergency departments has to do with how we use AI. The way in which we certainly start to algorithmically place our own implicit biases in systems is a real danger. So how do we start to design for that? How do we be intentional for that? How do we create checks and balances for that, right? So I mean, that's something that we actively think about every day in this work, and it's something that if a VC isn't actively thinking about it, then it's likely that they probably won't have an impact in that space. So I mean, it's something that has to be intentional.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. To round out, I just had a question come through the chat about whether you've experienced unfair treatment in the workplace and how you've resolved it, and whether you have any words of wisdom for younger women who face similar battles in their career, in trying to establish authenticity and trying to get people to believe in you, especially in an industry filled with biases.
So I'll actually say that I haven't experienced that from the work that I do that's more on the administrative innovation side. I certainly have experienced that as a clinician on behalf of my patients. I think the rule of thumb is to understand how best to navigate yourself to a position of safety if safety is ever an issue, and then beyond that, how you escalate things and use your voice. I think one of the things that I firmly believe in, or I'm very fortunate to have had the experiences that I have that enable me to speak very loudly, right? So when I say something, people tend to listen. And a lot of the people that I care for, they don't have that same sort of voice. So being able to escalate things and make people understand that these are very real concerns that must be addressed is something that I take with me every day. I think that no matter what the scenario, I think it's hard when you're in a role that you've applied for and you're enjoying, and you come across these scenarios. But I think it also becomes a piece of how will you feel when you go home at night about your work, about your colleagues, about that space, if you don't speak up for yourself? So that always becomes a really tough balance. And I think there are certainly avenues and ways to do that. And it's a place where you have to engage your mentors, frankly, to make sure that you're doing it in a way that you're protecting yourself on all fronts, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to echo that. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have people who, and actually before this current role, right, I had never had a woman manager before. So I've worked for men in positions of power who have sponsored me, who've believed in my ability to do the work, who have given me challenges, who have given me that ability to stretch, and who have supported me in sort of building out my network as well, and who have also never harassed me. And I realize that that is incredibly rare in this day and age, right? And I'm very grateful to have not been exposed to some of the really terrible experiences, but I have seen where that can happen too, on the corporate side. And, honestly, I would say it really comes back to, both finding those people who are, not just your mentors, but your sponsors, the ones who will go to bat for you, the ones who are in those positions of power and who are going to be willing to put their credibility on the line to say, this person, I, like, I'm going to protect this person, right? Or, or sponsor you, or make sure that you get a say, and that your voice gets heard. So, and then whatever position of power you have, right? We all have positions of power as allies, to others who are less fortunate. And so I think it's, even, as students, right, there are ways in which you can speak up, right, for other people who are, potentially being marginalized, right? And that we can all sort of build that culture. So even though, you see that at various ranks of other organizations, right, I think it's a muscle that you can start exercising and building now, right? And I think that's a big piece of sort of what we want to do, is that, in venture capital, for example, right, money talks, right? So let's give it to people, who who have had to work harder, who are sometimes not being listened to, right? Because we want to listen to them and we want to give them a voice and that platform to bring their ideas, to the world. So a lot of that is just, kind of comes full circle, right? Who's in your corner, who's in your network, and it can be fluid over time, and it absolutely will be, but really thinking about how do you help others, and then how do you think about, building those relationships with others as well who will help you. I think that's really key to being able to navigate some of these challenges.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy and Monique, for a full hour of wisdom. I feel like we've really been on a journey through so much of what there is to know about healthcare in the VC space. I really appreciate you guys being so open with your personal experiences, providing so many tangible tips for our attendees to take away with them as they embark in their careers and their startup journeys, and also speaking to what's a super important issue, women of color in the healthcare space, and the special care resources that they need. I was wondering if, there'd be a way for you to leave your contact details with our attendees so that they can get in touch with you following the event. If they have any follow-up questions, that would be super, super helpful and really, really appreciated.
Yes.
I'm just posting mine in the chat in case anyone wants to look me up. Smith_M at post.harvard.edu. You can always find me in the my directory.
And I've got my email in the chat as well, or you can find me on LinkedIn. So yeah, but I think it's, we believe in the power of the next generation, right? And that's all of you, right? And I mean, the fact that you're doing this on a Saturday night, I mean, obviously I think speaks volumes to your commitment, right? And so I think that's something that, when you retain that curiosity, when you retain that drive to sort of educate yourself and to step outside your comfort zone, I mean, that's something that you'll be rewarded for, as you move forward in your careers. So it's really great to see the interest and the commitment from all of you too.
Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. And also, guys, thank you so much for coming. We hope you really, really enjoyed it. I know that I did. I learned a lot. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with Monique and Tracy following the event. Thank you so much, guys.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.